The anniversary card was still on the mantelpiece when I first noticed something was wrong. It was propped against the clock we'd bought in Portugal on our 25th anniversary, a small ceramic piece, hand-painted, slightly chipped on one corner from a move we'd made 14 years ago. Linda had written inside the card, 40 years and I'd choose you again. I'd read it 3 times on the morning of our anniversary dinner, standing in the hallway in my good shirt, feeling the particular fullness that comes from a life built exactly the way you'd hoped. I'd believed every word she wrote. I want to say that plainly, before anything else. I believed it completely. My name is Jack. I'm 62 years old, recently retired after 3 decades as a civil engineer for the county. Bridges, drainage systems, the unglamorous infrastructure that holds a town together beneath its surface. I mention the profession because it shaped the way I think, methodically, with attention to load-bearing details, with a deep respect for the difference between what a structure looks like and what it actually is. I believed I applied that same rigor to my marriage. I believed I knew what was holding it up. I was wrong about that in ways that took me a long time to fully understand. The anniversary dinner itself was lovely. We went to a restaurant we'd been to perhaps a dozen times over the years. Not remarkable food, but the particular comfort of familiar things. The corner table we always requested, the waiter who remembered Linda's preference for still water, the way the candlelight made her look the way she had at 35. She wore a blue dress I'd always loved and pearl earrings her mother had given her. We talked about the children, about the garden she was planning for spring, about a trip to Ireland we'd been loosely discussing for years. She laughed at something I said, genuinely, easily, and reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. That was September 14th. By September 18th, something had changed. I couldn't have named it precisely. It was atmospheric, a shift in the quality of the air between us, like the pressure drop before weather arrives. She was quieter, not cold, not distant in any dramatic way, but turned slightly inward, as if attending to something I couldn't see. I asked, on the 3rd evening, whether she was feeling all right. She said she was tired, that the summer had worn her down, that she needed the autumn to settle. I accepted this. Of course I did. 40 years of marriage produces its own vocabulary of acceptable explanations, and tired was one I knew well. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for another 4 months, was that on the evening of our anniversary dinner, while I was paying the bill and retrieving our coats from the front, Linda had received a text message that she'd read and deleted before I returned to the table. I know this now because Dennis, the private investigator I eventually hired, is thorough in ways I couldn't have anticipated. He recovered the deletion timestamp from a phone backup. September 14th, 9:47 p.m. The sender's name in her contacts, Samantha. There was no Samantha. There never had been. That detail, the ghost of a deleted message on the night of our 40th anniversary, is the thing I return to most. Not the photos, not the recordings, not the folder of evidence that eventually sat on our kitchen table between us like a verdict. That deleted text. The care she took, in the moment when we should have been most entirely ourselves, to make sure I wouldn't see. I drove home from the restaurant that night holding her hand across the gear shift, the way we had on every long drive since 1987, and she let me hold it, and she looked out the window at the passing streetlights, and I have wondered, in the long months since, what she was thinking. Whether she felt anything that night. Whether 40 years weighs the same on both sides of a secret. But that was September. The knowing, the real, documented, undeniable knowing, came later. What arrived first was a feeling. A small, persistent wrongness that I kept finding reasons to explain away. We had built our retirement around a vision that was specific in its pleasures. Slow mornings with coffee and the newspaper, Thursday drives to the farmer's market, the garden Linda had been planning since before I'd stopped working, dinner parties for the friends we'd accumulated over 4 decades of suburban life. I had retired in January of that year, and by September the vision had largely materialized. We were, by any observable measure, doing well. Linda had her routines, which I respected without scrutinizing. She'd always been more socially active than me, where I was content with small gatherings and quiet evenings. She maintained a broader network of friendships with an ease I'd always admired. Tuesday mornings, her book club, a group of 8 women who'd been meeting monthly for 11 years. Thursday afternoons, coffee or lunch with Carol, her closest friend since their children had been in school together. Occasional evening events, gallery openings, charity functions, birthday dinners for women in her circle whose names I knew by association but not by face. I had never had any reason to examine these arrangements. Why would I? They were the texture of her life, as familiar and unremarkable to me as the Portuguese clock on the mantelpiece. What changed after September was subtle enough that I questioned my own perception for weeks before I trusted it. The phone was the first thing. Linda had always been relaxed about technology, left her phone on the kitchen charger at night, took calls in whatever room she happened to be in, had never struck me as a person who needed privacy in that particular way. By October, the phone had become something she kept close. Not obviously, not in a way that would have registered to a casual observer, but close. Always within arm's reach, always screened down when set on a surface, taken into the bathroom during evening routines that had never previously required it. Once, sitting together in the living room after dinner, her phone buzzed on the arm of the sofa between us. She picked it up with a speed that seemed involuntary, the way you flinch before you've decided to, and read whatever was there with an expression that moved through several things before settling into careful neutrality. She set the phone back down. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Carol," she said, asking about next week. I looked at the television. I said nothing more. But something had registered. Not suspicion exactly. Not yet. But a small flag raised in a part of my mind that I tried to dismiss as the paranoia of a newly retired man with too much time to notice things. I tried, genuinely, to believe that was all it was. The second thing was subtler. Linda had always dressed with a certain practical elegance. She had taste, and she exercised it, but without performance. What I noticed in October and November was a new deliberateness about certain outings. A particular silk blouse worn twice in 1 week for 2 different friend gatherings. Earrings she'd owned for years but rarely chose. Appearing on a Thursday afternoon for what she described as coffee with Carol at their usual place. The faint trace of a perfume I hadn't noticed her wearing in the house for months, detectable when she kissed my cheek before leaving. None of these things meant anything individually. I know that. I cataloged them reluctantly, the way you catalog symptoms you hope don't add up to a diagnosis. Our son Michael came for Sunday dinner in mid-November. He was 36 then, lived 40 minutes away, worked in finance, and had inherited from me a preference for directness that he'd learned, over the years, to deploy carefully. Over dessert, he looked at Linda with a quality of attention that I recognized because I'd been wearing the same expression myself for weeks, a watchful, slightly puzzled assessment that he was trying not to make obvious. Later, while we were clearing dishes and Linda was in the other room, he said quietly, "Is Mom doing okay?" "She's been a bit tired," I said. The same explanation I'd been giving myself. He dried a glass carefully and didn't quite let it go. She seemed somewhere else tonight, like she was in a different conversation. I told him retirement was an adjustment for both of us. He nodded, not fully persuaded, and changed the subject. I was grateful for that, and I was also aware that what I'd given him was not the truth but the version of events that preserved the most for the longest, for him, for myself, for a marriage I wasn't ready to examine in the light. I didn't sleep well that November. I'd wake at 3 or 4 in the morning and lie in the dark beside Linda, her breathing steady and soft, entirely untroubled, and I would take inventory of what I knew and what I didn't, and what I was afraid to find out. I had been married to this woman for 40 years. I had built a life alongside her with the same care I brought to every structure I'd ever engineered, with attention to the foundations, to the load distribution, to the small details that determined whether something would hold under pressure. I had been so certain it would hold. I understood then that certainty, in a marriage, is not the same as knowledge. It is a feeling you maintain by choosing, repeatedly, and with increasing effort, not to test it. December brought a moment I couldn't explain away. Linda came home from a Tuesday book club meeting at 4:40 in the afternoon. Later than usual, though not remarkably so. She was composed, pleasant, full of commentary about the book they'd discussed, a novel I hadn't read but nodded along to. We made dinner together, moved around the kitchen in the choreography of decades, and ate at the table by the window. It was a perfectly ordinary evening. 2 days later, running low on milk, I stopped at the supermarket on the way back from a morning walk. In the parking lot, getting out of my car, I saw Carol, Linda's Thursday coffee companion, her book club co-member, loading groceries into her trunk. I waved. She smiled and came over. We talked for a few minutes. The comfortable small talk of people who've known each other in the context of a friendship between their wives. Linda and I keep missing each other, Carol said, near the end. Tell her I said we need to actually pin down a date before the new year. I drove home on autopilot. Carol hadn't been to book club on Tuesday. Linda had mentioned Carol specifically, had mentioned something Carol said about the book, had used her name as an anchor for a story about the discussion. Either Carol had left early and Linda hadn't mentioned it, or Carol hadn't been there at all. I sat in the driveway for several minutes before going inside. That evening, I watched my wife of 40 years tell me about her day with the same warmth, the same eye contact, the same small gestures of intimacy that had been the furniture of our shared life for decades. And I understood, for the first time with genuine clarity, that I was no longer sure which version of Linda I was talking to. January arrived cold and clear, and I stopped pretending. Not outwardly. Outwardly, I maintained everything, the surface of our life as smooth and familiar as it had always been. I made coffee in the mornings. I drove Linda to her appointments when she needed the car. I attended a New Year's Eve gathering at our neighbor's house and stood with my arm around my wife and talked about the year ahead and said all the right things. But inside I had reorganized. The comfortable assumption that Linda's small behavioral shifts were fatigue or mood or the private weather of a person I didn't need to understand every moment of had been replaced by something quieter and more watchful. I began keeping notes. Not a formal record, nothing dramatic, just a small notebook I kept in my study desk in which I wrote dates and times and observations. January 7th. Linda out from 2 p.m. to 7:30. Said she was visiting her old colleague Diane. Came home with a faint energy that wasn't consistent with an afternoon visit with a colleague she saw infrequently. January 12th. Phone taken to bathroom at 10 p.m. Came back 15 minutes later. January 16th. Asked about Diane's new apartment, which she'd mentioned previously. Linda answered fluently, with detail, but one detail contradicted something she'd said in November. The contradictions were small. That was the thing that troubled me most. A less careful liar would have contradicted herself more obviously. Linda's inconsistencies were the inconsistencies of someone who was managing a story rather than inventing one wholesale. Tiny seam lines in an otherwise convincing fabric, visible only because I was now looking with the particular attention of someone who already suspected the pattern. I called Diane in late January. It was not a decision I made slowly. I was in my study on a Tuesday morning, Linda at her book club, and Diane's number was in my phone from years of social overlap, and I dialed before I'd fully decided to. I said I was trying to get a recommendation for a restaurant Linda had mentioned Diane raving about. Diane said she'd love to help, but she genuinely couldn't think which one I meant. They hadn't gotten together since before Christmas, maybe earlier, she couldn't quite remember. She said Linda kept meaning to visit, but things kept coming up. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in the chair in my study and looked at the garden through the window. The bare winter garden Linda was planning to transform in spring, the garden she'd described to me with such specific enthusiasm just the week before, and I felt something settle in my chest like cold weight. Linda had told me she'd been to Diane's twice in the past 2 months. Diane hadn't seen her since before Christmas at the earliest. The gap between these two facts was not ambiguous. I didn't confront her that evening. I made dinner. I asked about her day. She described the book club discussion with the same fluency she always brought to these accounts. Names, opinions, small interpersonal dynamics I was meant to find mildly interesting. I listened and I nodded and I kept my face as neutral as I could manage. And underneath the neutrality something had hardened into a decision I hadn't quite articulated yet, but was already moving toward. Michael called the following week. He'd spoken to his sister Sarah. He said she'd called from across the country, apparently having sensed something in a recent phone call with Linda that she couldn't quite define. They were both asking, in the careful oblique way of adult children who don't want to name the thing they're afraid of, whether everything was all right. I told Michael what I'd been telling myself for months, that Linda and I were fine, that retirement created adjustment periods, that long marriages had their seasons. He accepted this because I delivered it with the steadiness of a man who'd spent 40 years being the stable one, the practical one, the one who didn't raise alarm unnecessarily. What I didn't tell him was that I'd been awake until 2 in the morning the night before, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, looking at the address book that had fallen from the counter. fallen open to the page with the entry that had been nagging at me since I'd seen it 3 weeks earlier. Peter. A local number. A business address I recognized as a small accounting firm on Harwick Street, about 2 miles from our house. The entry written in Linda's careful handwriting, not filed under any business heading, not notated with any professional context. Just the name. Underlined once. Peter was not someone I knew. Peter had never been mentioned in connection with any context I could recall. Not a mutual friend, not a former colleague of Linda's, not anyone connected to our children or neighbors. Linda's address book was a document accumulated over decades, layered with the sediment of a life's worth of relationships, and I knew nearly every name in it. I did not know Peter. I stood in the winter garden for a long time after finding it. Not because I'd concluded anything, not yet, but because I was standing at the threshold of a conclusion I'd been approaching for months, and I understood that crossing it would change the shape of everything. The private investigator's name was Dennis. He'd been recommended by a former colleague whose divorce, an ugly, complicated thing 3 years earlier, I'd observed from a respectful distance. My colleague had mentioned Dennis briefly, in the context of having had help when he needed it, and I'd filed the name away without imagining I'd ever need it. I called him on a Monday morning in February while Linda was at the hairdresser. He had an office downtown, a second-floor suite above a dry cleaner, and I sat across from him on a Tuesday afternoon and explained what I knew and what I suspected in the same tone I'd have used presenting a structural assessment, factual, organized, without unnecessary embellishment. He listened without expression and asked precise questions. He told me what he could provide and what it would cost and what the timeline would likely be. He did not offer sympathy or commentary. I respected that. I wrote him a check. I drove home. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the anniversary card still propped on the mantelpiece. 40 years, and I'd choose you again. I wondered whether she meant it when she wrote it. I wondered whether those words had already been half a lie on the morning I'd read them, and felt so completely certain of my life. Dennis worked with a thoroughness that was both reassuring and, at times, almost unbearable. He'd told me 2 to 3 weeks for a meaningful picture to develop. I spent those weeks in a state I couldn't have described to anyone who hadn't been in it. A suspension, a simultaneous presence and absence, living in the surface of my life, while something else ran quietly beneath it. I was still the same Jack at the dinner table. Still the same Jack who drove Linda to her Thursday appointments and asked about her book club and made weekend pancakes and called Michael and Sarah on Sundays. The performance was not difficult in the way I might have expected. What made it possible was something I'm not proud of. I had been practicing it for months without knowing it. Every time I'd noticed something and chosen not to ask, every time I'd explained away a contradiction rather than confronting it, I had been rehearsing this exact compartmentalization. It came naturally because I had been building toward it all year. Dennis sent his first report in late February. It was a document of 11 pages, factual and precise, accompanied by photographs. I read it alone in my study on a Wednesday morning while Linda was at book club. I read it once quickly and then again slowly, and by the time I'd finished the second reading, I was sitting very still in my chair with the pages on the desk in front of me and the garden visible through the window, and a stillness in my body that felt like the stillness after a structure fails, the moment after the sound, before you understand the full extent of what's collapsed. Peter was 58 years old. He owned the accounting firm on Harwick Street, had done so for 12 years. He was divorced, had been for 4 years. He was a member of the same charity board Linda had joined 3 years ago, the Historical Society Fundraising Committee, something she described at the time as wanting to do something with her free time before I retired. I remembered her mentioning the committee. I thought it was admirable. They had met on that committee. Dennis had confirmed this through committee records and cross-referenced it with Linda's calendar, which she'd kept in a shared family app that she had apparently forgotten I had access to, or perhaps had never considered I'd look at it with this particular attention. The affair had been ongoing, Dennis estimated based on communication patterns and meeting frequency, for approximately 22 to 24 months. 2 years. I sat with that number. 2 years placed the beginning somewhere in the autumn of the year before last, before my retirement, before our Ruby anniversary plans, before the card on the mantelpiece. 40 years, and I'd choose you again. She had written those words after 2 years of choosing someone else, every Tuesday and Thursday, in restaurants and hotel rooms, and this was in Dennis's second report, the one that arrived in early March, in Peter's home on Harwick Street, to which she had a key. She had a key to another man's house. Dennis documented 11 meetings in the 3 weeks of his active surveillance. Lunches at a restaurant across town that Linda had described to me on multiple occasions as a place she'd heard was good and kept meaning to try, which I now understood was a private joke she was telling herself. 3 afternoon visits to Peter's house. One evening, I remembered clearly. Linda had told me she was attending a fundraising event for the Historical Society, had kissed me goodbye in the hallway at 6:30, looking particularly composed and lovely in a gray dress I'd complimented. Dennis had a photograph of her arriving at Peter's house at 6:50 that evening. She was still in the gray dress. There were other documents. Dennis had, through means he described as standard in his industry, obtained a partial record of the communication between Linda and Peter conducted through a messaging app both of them used. The messages were not extensive in what Dennis shared. He was careful about legal parameters, and I was grateful for that. But what he had was enough. Enough to establish the duration, the frequency, the nature, and one exchange that I read 3 times and then set down and did not return to. Peter had asked, in a message from the previous April, "Have you thought any more about what we discussed?" Linda's response, "I think about it constantly. I just need a little more time." I did not know, and still do not know, what they had discussed, what she needed more time for. Whether it was time to leave me, or time to end the affair, or time to decide between 2 versions of her life that she had been running simultaneously for 2 years. I didn't ask Dennis to find out. Some questions, I decided, were not mine to have answered. The moral complexity of what I was doing, paying a man to surveil my wife, reading documents assembled through methods I hadn't examined too closely, building a case against a woman who didn't know she was being studied, was not lost on me. I sat with it. There were moments, particularly in the evenings when Linda and I were in the same room, and she was entirely unaware of what I now knew, when I felt something close to shame about the asymmetry of it. She was living inside her life, and I was outside it now, watching through glass. But I had tried the alternative. I had spent 4 months asking gentle questions and accepting gentle explanations and looking carefully away from the things I was afraid to see. The gentleness had not served either of us. What I was doing now was simply seeing clearly, finally, what had been true for 2 years while I'd maintained the comfortable fiction of not knowing. Karen was my lawyer. She came recommended by a friend of Michael's, a family law specialist who was, as Michael described her, not warm, but extremely effective. I met her in her office on a Thursday afternoon in early March, the same Thursday that Linda told me she was having lunch with Carol, and I put Dennis's folder on her desk and explained the situation. Karen reviewed the documents with professional speed. She asked about assets, about the house, about retirement accounts and savings. She asked about my intentions. I told her I wasn't sure yet, that I wanted to understand my position before I made any decisions. She told me I was in a strong position. She told me to do nothing that would compromise it legally. She told me not to confront Linda until I decided what outcome I was working toward, because the confrontation would determine the dynamic of everything that followed. I thanked her. I drove home. Linda was already there when I arrived, stirring something on the stove, and she turned and smiled when she heard the door, and I hung up my coat and went to the kitchen and asked if she needed help, and she said no. It was almost ready, and we ate dinner together in the kitchen by the window and talked about Michael's upcoming visit and a film we'd been meaning to watch, and everything was exactly as it had always been, and nothing would ever be exactly as it had always been again. I had decided, somewhere between Karen's office and my own kitchen, that I would give myself 2 more weeks. 2 weeks to be certain. 2 weeks to determine whether what I thought I wanted, confrontation, clarity, the end of the suspension, was actually what I wanted when measured against 40 years of everything else. What I discovered in those 2 weeks was that certainty, once arrived at, doesn't require additional time. It only requires courage. And courage was something I'd been rationing very carefully for a very long time. I chose a Sunday. Not for any particular strategic reason. Not because of what day it was in relation to Linda's schedule or Peter's or any other external factor. I chose Sunday because it was the day we had always, throughout our marriage, kept for ourselves. No commitments, no social obligations. Just the 2 of us and the house and the rhythm of a shared life. It felt, in some way I couldn't fully articulate, like the right container for what needed to happen. like the only honest setting for a conversation about 40 years. I made breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee, the way I always made it on Sundays. I brought it to the kitchen table and Linda came down in her robe and poured herself coffee, and we ate together in the morning quiet and talked about small things. The weather, a neighbor's new fence, a book she was reading. The ordinary texture of a Sunday morning. I ate and listened and watched her face across the table and tried to memorize it exactly as it was in that moment. Relaxed, unguarded, still. After the dishes were cleared, I went to my study. I came back with Dennis's folder and Karen's notes and the small notebook I'd kept since January, and I set them on the table in front of her without saying anything first. Linda looked at the folder. She looked at my face. Something passed through her expression, not surprise exactly, but a recognition. As if she'd known this moment was somewhere on the horizon and had been watching for it without quite believing it would arrive. She opened the folder. I sat down across from her, and I waited. She went through it slowly. The photographs. The timeline Dennis had assembled. The meeting log. The partial message record. She turned each page with a steadiness that surprised me, and when she reached the end, she closed the folder and set it on the table and placed both hands flat on top of it, as if she were holding it down, and she looked at the window rather than at me. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Definitively, since February," I said. "Suspecting, since October." She absorbed this. Her hands didn't move. "Jack." She turned to look at me then, and her face had changed. The Sunday morning ease entirely gone, replaced by something that I recognized after a moment as the face of someone preparing to tell the truth after a long time of not telling it. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to. There's no version of this where I'm not the person who did this." "No," I agreed. "There isn't. It started," she stopped. "Started again. It wasn't supposed to." She stopped a second time, and I saw her make a decision about what kind of conversation this would be. "It's been 2 years. I think you can tell that from what's there. It started at the Historical Society. I didn't go looking for it." "I know you didn't go looking for it," I said. "That doesn't change what it is." "No." Her voice was quiet and controlled in a way I recognized from every difficult conversation we'd had over 40 years. Linda didn't fall apart easily, had always preferred to hold her composure under pressure, and she was holding it now, though I could see the cost of it in the set of her jaw. "I know that." I asked her about the message. Peter's question about what they'd discussed. Her answer about needing more time. A long silence. He asked me whether I wanted to, whether I was thinking about leaving. She said it carefully, looking at the table. "That was last April. I hadn't decided anything." "I wasn't." She looked up. "I wasn't planning to leave, Jack. I want you to know that. But you weren't planning to stop, either." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. What followed was 3 hours of conversation, the longest we'd had in years, possibly ever, about the actual interior of things rather than the surface. Linda talked, and I listened, and then I talked, and she listened, and what came out was not a confession so much as an excavation. She told me she'd felt invisible for years, not unloved, she was careful to say, but unseen. That I had been present in the house and absent from her, that the retirement she'd imagined, the reconnection, the slow mornings, the time to be a couple again, had not materialized in the way she'd hoped. That Peter had paid attention to her in a specific way that she'd found, against her better judgment, irresistible. I listened to this. I tried to hear it without the defensiveness that rose in me immediately, the desire to contest it, to point to evidence of my presence and attentiveness, to argue against her characterization of our marriage. But underneath the defensiveness was something I couldn't entirely dismiss: recognition. I knew I had coasted in recent years. I knew that retirement had been, in my imagination, primarily about my own needs and rhythms, and that I hadn't asked Linda enough about hers. I knew that the man I'd been at 40, more curious about her, more attentive to what she needed, had been replaced, incrementally, by a man who assumed. I am not saying her choices were my fault. They weren't. She made them. She sustained them for 2 years with a consistency that required real effort and real deception. But I understood, in that kitchen on that Sunday morning, that a marriage is not a structure one person builds and one person occupies. It is built by both, maintained by both, and neglected by both when it begins to fail. That understanding did not save us. But it mattered. By afternoon, Linda had called Peter. She did it in the kitchen, while I sat in the living room, and I didn't listen to the conversation. I heard the tone, controlled, brief, definitive, and when she came back into the room, she sat down across from me and said, "It's over. I ended it." I nodded. "What happens now?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. She asked if I wanted her to leave. I said I didn't know that either. I said I needed time, which was true, and that I thought she probably did too, which was also true, and that we should not make permanent decisions while standing in the middle of something this large. She nodded. She went upstairs. I sat in the living room until it got dark, and then I turned on a lamp and sat some more. And the house was quiet around me in a way that felt entirely different from the quiet of an ordinary Sunday evening, though nothing visible had changed. Michael and Sarah had to be told. We agreed on that, separately and then together, and Linda made those calls herself. A choice I neither requested nor resisted, but that seemed right. I could hear, from upstairs, the quality of the silences on her end of the calls, and I understood from those silences alone how those conversations went. Michael came the following weekend. He sat at the kitchen table with me for a long time and said very little, which was exactly what I needed. Sarah flew in 3 weeks later, and she and Linda had a conversation that I was not part of and didn't ask about afterward. And for weeks afterward, Sarah called me every Sunday just to talk, which was something she hadn't done regularly in years. The machinery of response moved forward. Karen began preliminary divorce filings, held in reserve, while Linda and I made an appointment with Dr. Mason, a therapist Karen had mentioned as someone several of her clients had found useful, which was Karen's careful way of acknowledging that not all the marriages she worked on ended immediately. I was not, at that point, certain mine would end at all. I was in too much pain to know what I wanted. What I knew was that the woman sitting across from me in Dr. Mason's office that first Thursday evening was genuinely remorseful. Not performatively, not strategically, but with the specific weight of someone who had understood, fully, what they'd done and what it had cost. That mattered. It didn't repair anything, but it mattered. We tried. I want to say that clearly, because it's the truth, and because it complicates the story in ways that I think are important to acknowledge. For 2 years after the confrontation, Linda and I went to Dr. Mason every Thursday. We talked in ways we hadn't talked in decades, about what we each needed, what we'd failed to give each other, what we'd assumed, and what we'd never said. Linda was consistent and honest in those sessions in a way I hadn't expected. She didn't minimize what she'd done. She didn't build a case for herself. She took responsibility with a completeness that I found, as the months passed, genuinely admirable, even as I was still sitting across from her in a therapist's office because of what she'd done. I tried to forgive. I tried in the way you try to lift something very heavy, with real effort, with the real desire to succeed, with the understanding that the alternative was to remain permanently in the same posture of pain. I had days when it felt close. Sunday mornings, particularly, when the house had its old quality and Linda and I were easy with each other in the kitchen, when I could almost reach the version of myself who hadn't known what I now knew. Almost. But there were other days. Ordinary days, unremarkable days, days when nothing specific happened to trigger anything. And I would look across the dinner table or over the edge of a book and see her face and feel, beneath whatever warmth I genuinely still had for her, a cold layer of knowledge that didn't go away. The knowledge of 2 years. The key to another man's house. The deleted text on our anniversary night. The voice of a woman I'd loved for 40 years saying, in a message to her lover, "I just need a little more time." Trust, I learned in those 2 years of trying, is not rebuilt the way a structure is rebuilt, with new materials laid carefully on an old foundation. What's broken in a marriage is not the surface, but the thing beneath the surface, the invisible thing you didn't know you were relying on until it was gone. I had believed, for 40 years, that I knew who Linda was in the private architecture of herself, her integrity, her fundamental choices, the person she was when no one was watching. That belief was the foundation, and it had not been correct. And I could not, with any amount of therapy or effort or genuine goodwill, rebuild my confidence in a foundation I now knew had been wrong. Dr. Mason didn't tell us to stop trying. That wasn't her role and wasn't her way. But in our second year of sessions, she asked a question that I've thought about many times since. She asked us each to describe what we were working toward, not in terms of the marriage, but in terms of our own well-being. What did we each want our lives to feel like? Linda said she wanted to feel forgiven. I said I wanted to feel at peace. Dr. Mason let those two answers sit in the room for a moment. She didn't analyze them or connect them. She just let them be there, and I understood, hearing both of them in the same space, that they were not the same answer, and that the gap between them was the thing that all the work we were doing had not been able to close. Linda and I decided together, about 18 months after the confrontation, that we would separate. The decision was not dramatic. There was no final argument, no breaking point, no moment where something shattered that had previously been intact. There was a conversation on a Sunday evening, a Sunday again, always Sunday, that was quiet and honest and, in its way, kind. We talked about the house, about the finances, about telling Michael and Sarah. We talked about what the previous 2 years had meant to each of us and what we thought the future looked like. Linda cried. I held her hand and meant it, and the grief I felt was real. Not the acute grief of the confrontation, but something longer and lower, the grief of something that had simply run its course. She was not my enemy. She had never been my enemy. She was a person who had made choices I couldn't live inside of, and I was a person whose capacity for forgiveness had reached its limit, and both of those things were true simultaneously. Karen handled the divorce with the efficiency I'd come to rely on from her. It was amicable, which given everything felt like its own kind of achievement, a last joint project, managed well. The house sold in the spring. I took an apartment on the other side of town, near the river, with tall windows and a small balcony where I grew tomatoes in the summer and kept a chair for reading in the evenings. Michael visited often, more often than before, with a quiet consistency that I understood was his way of attending to me without making it obvious. Sarah flew in for a week in the fall, and we went to the coast for 2 days, the way Linda and I had always planned and never quite managed, and walked on the beach in November light, and talked about her life and mine and the things we were figuring out, and it was one of the best 2 days I'd had in a long time. I thought about Linda. I still do. Not with bitterness, or not primarily, not anymore. She had moved to a smaller place across town. We'd run into each other once, in the spring, outside the hardware store. We'd talked for perhaps 10 minutes, carefully and warmly, in the way of people who share 40 years of history and have arrived at something like peace about what that history cost them. She looked well. I told her so. She said the same to me, and I believed she meant it. She called once, 8 months after the divorce was finalized. A Wednesday afternoon, unexpected. I answered. She said she wasn't calling to relitigate anything, that she just wanted me to know she was in therapy, that she understood things about herself she hadn't understood before, that she was sorry. Not the reflexive sorry of the confrontation morning, but something slower and more considered, the apology of someone who had actually done the internal work. I thanked her. I told her I was glad she was doing well. She said she hoped I was too. We hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment afterward and noticed that what I felt was not anger and not grief, but something that was almost, quietly, nothing at all. And nothing, in this case, was its own kind of arrival. I run in the mornings now, which I haven't done since my 40s. The river path near my apartment is quiet before 7. Just the water and the birds and the particular silver light of early morning that makes everything look like the beginning of something. I think about many things on those runs. Sometimes I think about Linda. Sometimes I think about the man I was in the middle years of our marriage. Competent, reliable, consistently present in body and consistently absent from the deeper requirements of a person I'd taken completely for granted. I don't flagellate myself for it, but I carry it, the way you carry the knowledge of a structural error you made early in a project. Not with shame, but with the intention of not making it again. I'm not lonely in the way I feared I might be. I have Michael and Sarah, and I have friends I'd neglected during the long years of suburban couplehood who have turned out, in retirement, to be excellent company. I have the tomatoes on the balcony and the river in the mornings and the quiet evenings that belong entirely to me. And I have arrived, somewhere in the middle of all of this, at a peace I did not expect to find this cleanly. It's not the peace I imagined when I read that anniversary card on a September morning in my hallway, in my good shirt, feeling like the luckiest man I knew. That peace was built on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. This one is built on something I actually know. For 2 years, she kept a key to another man's house on the same keyring as the key to ours, and in that small, practical detail lives something worth sitting with for a moment. Linda was not, by any simple measure, a cruel person. The evidence of 40 years argues strongly against cruelty. She was present, she was warm, she was genuinely attentive to her children and to the texture of a shared life. What she was, running beneath all of that, was someone who had been quietly disappearing inside her own marriage for years without saying so. Not because she lacked the words, but because the words required a confrontation she didn't believe she could survive. The affair with Peter was not, at its root, about Peter. It was about the accumulated weight of unspoken needs meeting someone who, for whatever reason of timing or personality or simple proximity, happened to notice her at the right moment. That doesn't justify 2 years of sustained deception, but it does explain something important about how people arrive at choices they would never have predicted for themselves. Jack's failure, and he had one, regardless of where the moral weight ultimately falls, was a failure of the particular kind that comes from loving someone for so long that you stop actively choosing them. There is a complacency that masquerades as security, a settled certainty about who someone is that functions, over time, as a form of absence. He was there. He was dependable, present, faithful in every way except the one that perhaps mattered most, the daily, renewable act of curiosity about the person sleeping next to him. Not curiosity about her schedule or her preferences or the facts of her life, but about her interior, what she needed, what she feared, where she felt the marriage was insufficient. He never asked those questions, not because he didn't care, but because he'd stopped believing the answers might be different from what he assumed. What the 2 years of therapy revealed, in the end, was not that the marriage was irreparable. It was that the two people trying to repair it were working toward different things. Linda needed absolution, not from Jack specifically, but from herself, and she was looking to the marriage as the vehicle for receiving it. Jack needed something he couldn't articulate in Dr. Mason's office, but understood clearly when he heard Linda's answer. He needed peace that wasn't contingent on trust he could no longer fully locate. These are not incompatible goals in a different set of circumstances. In theirs, they had become a kind of quiet impasse. The accumulation effect is worth naming. No single event broke this marriage. It was broken by a decade of small, withheld conversations, of needs politely unmentioned, of the gradual replacement of genuine intimacy with the performance of it. The affair was the rupture that made the structural weakness visible, but the weakness had been there, unremarked, for years before Peter ever attended a historical society committee meeting. This is, perhaps, the hardest thing to accept about betrayal in a long marriage, that it rarely comes entirely from nowhere, that the ground it grows in was prepared by both people, however unequally. Jack rebuilt. That matters, and it's not as simple as it sounds. Rebuilding at 62, after 40 years inside a particular identity, husband, partner, the stable one, requires a kind of courage that has nothing to do with confrontation and everything to do with allowing yourself to be a different person than the one you've been. The man who runs by the river in the mornings and grows tomatoes on his balcony is not the man who stood in his hallway in September feeling like the luckiest man he knew. He's something more accurate, harder one, perhaps more genuinely at peace because the peace is no longer dependent on an assumption that turned out to be false. The question the story doesn't answer, and perhaps can't, is what Linda is working toward now. Her therapy, her slower and more considered apology, her apparent reckoning with herself. These suggest a person genuinely attempting to understand what she did and why. Whether that understanding arrives in time to matter, and to whom, is its own open question. Some things end not because they were wrong from the beginning, but because they were right for long enough that the ending is its own kind of tragedy. That's a harder category than betrayal. It requires a different kind of grieving. What stays with me, long after this story settles, is something quieter than the betrayal itself. It's the image of a man who spent 40 years being reliably present and somehow, in all that reliability, forgot to keep showing up in the ways that actually count. We talk about infidelity as if it arrives like a storm, sudden, external, something that happens to a marriage. But sometimes it grows in the silence between two people who stopped asking each other the difficult questions. That's not an excuse for what Linda did. It's a reminder that love isn't a thing you possess. It's a thing you practice every day with the specific person in front of you, not the version of them you assumed years ago. Maybe the most honest thing this story offers is that question. When did you last actually look?